and thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation about gender and the liberal arts. The notion of the liberal arts, by happy coincidence, was established for the West in the very period of my research and writing, later antiquity. Notwithstanding debates about the precise dating of the notion or the subjects to be included as liberal arts. Some that we would place in that category, for example, the national languages and literatures of Europe, had of course not yet come into being in late antiquity. I'll begin by signaling some recent interventions regarding liberal arts education and make a few observations about its development and the development of the academic study of religion in America. After highlighting some points concerning gender, using some examples from my own career, which I suspect was not atypical for young women of my generation, I'll turn to changes in women's and gender studies in the humanities, especially in the study of early Christianity, and conclude with some comments about gender and education that I hope will lead to lively conversations among all of you. In recent weeks, higher education in general, and the liberal arts in particular, have gotten quite a bit of press. In the January 22nd supplement to the New York Times, Education Life, former Harvard president Lawrence Summers outlined what education would or should look like in the 21st century. His assessment was almost entirely driven by the supreme importance of technology, numbers, and data. His predictions are goal-oriented and humanities empty. Although Summers believes that cosmopolitanism is a necessary attribute for students in this century, he sees the ability to speak a foreign language as entirely unnecessary. By contrast, Nan Kahane, former president of Duke University, in a speech to the Council of Independent Colleges President's Institute, as excerpted in the Chronicle of Higher Education on January 31st, took a different line. For Kahane, liberal arts education teaches students to look at material from many different dimensions. It provides an exercise in learning how to learn, an important ability for many, many different various professions. Liberal education's emphasis on critical thinking, clear writing, and clear speaking is of great value no matter what profession a student chooses. Repeating a theme that resonated with educators of the 19th century, she argued that liberal education prepares a student for citizenship in a democratic society. Last, Kahane claimed that a liberal education furnishes students' minds with a wealth of material that provides them both for life and society and for solitude. Summers and Kahane's essays resonate with reports in the February 5th Chronicle that parents and educators in China, Singapore, and Hong Kong are urging the introduction of the liberal arts in high school and college education. They claim that the liberal arts help young people learn to think critically and creatively. These traits, however, seem not to be so much valued in themselves, according to the Chronicle report, but because business leaders in those areas are faulting traditional education as fostering, and I quote, inflexible thinking, inability to work in teams, and lack of creativity. These characteristics, business leaders believe, hinder graduates' participation in the global economy. My recent reading in the history of American higher education in the 19th century, in preparation for writing my book, Founding the Fathers, that was just mentioned and held up here, shows that the battles over the purpose of a college education and the collegiate curriculum were as ferocious then as now. The heavy stress on classical studies in 19th century American education has often been noted. The famous Yale Report of 1828, called The Most Influential Educational Statement of the Antebellum Period by historian Julie Rubin, this report defended the classical-oriented curriculum against proposed changes. The purpose of a Yale education, the report claimed, was to discipline mental faculties and to form character. not to impart knowledge or enlarge the mind's furniture, as they like to call it in those days. In 1869, Yale officers were still defending the classical curriculum against those who allegedly clamored, as they said, to substitute other subjects for Greek and Latin, or, as at Harvard, to institute an elective system, a change Yale professors deemed inexpedient and dangerous. President James McCosh of Princeton, in 1885, railed against electives, charging that the elective system allowed students to slack off, choosing easy courses and professors. As examples of such at Harvard, McCosh singled out music, art, French plays, and novels. Yeah, there we are. If we cannot prevent the evils of the elective system at Harvard, he exhorted, we may arrest it in the other colleges of the country. Although Greek and Latin language instruction did decline by the end of the century, the study of classical culture continued in a new guise. It was seen as an antidote to the materialism of the Gilded Age, mere getting and spending. So what constitutes the college curriculum and the liberal arts has been embattled for the major part of America's venture in higher education. How did the study of religion fit into the development of liberal arts education in America? As a side issue in my book, I explored how religion became a college subject, how it migrated from a seminary setting to undergraduate education, divinity as it was called. Throughout most of the 19th century, college seniors, even at those at the newer state-supported public institutions, customarily took a required course entitled Evidences of Christianity, often taught by the president of the college. This course, James Turner argues, what he calls the chief curricular fallout from Scottish common sense philosophy, was a hodgepodge of intellectual flotsam and jetsam, from political economy to the origin of language to animal rights. Evidences was usually the student's only actual course on religion. In the early 1870s, however, Evidences began to lose favor. Columbia discontinued it in 1871, Harvard in 1872, and other colleges and universities followed suit. By the end of the 19th century, some religion courses appear in the college curriculum. Between 1885 and 1900, Yale College increased its offerings in religion, open to undergraduates, from 3 courses to more than 50. By the early 20th century, new fields such as comparative religion and psychology of religion had found their way into university curricula. At the University of California, Berkeley, for example, 2 courses in Asian religions were added in 1900, and in 1904, a course entitled The Religious Practices and Beliefs of Non-Literary Peoples. In sum, something approaching religious studies was in the making. The study of religion as an aspect of culture was gathered into the new division of the humanities that had arisen to fill the void left by the declining emphasis on Greek and Latin. The category of humanities, scholars claim, assured university leaders, and doubtless parents, that the essence of religion could survive the loss of an explicitly Christian framework of knowledge. Humanities became a secular substitute for religiously based moral education, as did liberal culture. Yet, with some exceptions, only in the late 1920s and thereafter were departments of religion established in private colleges and universities. If religion was so slow to enter the college curriculum as an academic subject, the study of women and gender, to be sure, were even slower. When I attended graduate school in early Christian history, there was no gender, nor for that matter were there women, whether as subjects of study or professors. To be fair, this is not entirely accurate. Augustine's mother usually got mentioned in courses on early Christianity. And I did have one female religion teacher in a lowly instructor's role, Susan Sontag. This deficit was not due to my attending backward schools, as I gather you heard in the introduction. Vassar in the late 1950s was still a women's college, and I had a number of female professors, but none in religion or philosophy. Although students were reminded every time they entered the library that Vassar had been founded in the 1860s to give young women access to the quality higher education that their brothers enjoyed at men's colleges. There still was no instruction about women and their history in our classes. Everything was by and about men. The facts that women's colleges had developed since the 1860s and that women had been admitted along with men to other colleges and universities since the mid-19th century, Oberlin at its founding in 1833, University of Michigan, I believe we have, yes, in 1872, I believe women came there. This did not make a difference in the subject matter of the liberal arts curriculum. This was the era so strikingly displayed in the TV show Mad Men. At the time, there was no reason to protest this situation, since we simply took for granted this was the way the world was organized. As we are now aware, ideology works by making conditions that are the result of human design seem natural. We did not see ourselves as victims, even in that darkest of the 20th century decades for women, and our studies were intellectually stimulating. In graduate school, the female ambience I had enjoyed in college largely vanished. Graduate school was a male preserve. In my cohort at Columbia, one other woman completed the PhD in religion. The curriculum in history of Christianity had not seen the introduction of topics about women or gender. I confess that if I had taken my graduate advisor's suggestion that I write my dissertation on the question, did the church father Origen castrate himself? I might have had some thoughts about these lines, but the only thought I had when he proposed the topic was, what would you say at parties when people asked you what was the subject of your dissertation? I could foresee very bad jokes about evidence. I wrote instead on the use of Aristotelian philosophy by an early Christian theologian and began my teaching career at what was then the Women's College at the University of Virginia, Mary Washington College. The civil rights movement was in full swing in the 1960s and soon generated much discussion about rights in other areas. My experiences as an undergraduate at a women's college and my first years of teaching at a then women's college doubtless shaped my views that single-sex education may be a more empowering option for women than co-education. I realize this may be considered a dead issue, but I still ponder whether young women do not flourish better in an atmosphere that for at least a few years allows them to emerge as leaders. For all the changes in women's education, I still find that female undergraduates in a co-educational institutions are more wary to speak up, to try out unpopular ideas in front of their male classmates. Part of this wariness, to be sure, may stem from the felt pressure to perform well and please the professor in hope of future rewards, not from reluctance to appear assertive. But this reluctance probably is more obvious for those of us who teach smaller classes than in large lecture courses where students are not on the spot regarding participation in every single class session. Now, I'd be quite interested in hearing opinions on this subject from those of you teaching in different types of institutions. I turn now to women's history. The beginning of the women's movement in the world outside the academy gave an impetus to the study of women within the academy. Women, gender, and sexuality became worthy scholarly topics for historical, literary, psychological, and sociological investigation. One of the bigger payoffs was the development of the field, women in history. Women of the past, if suitably recaptured, we thought, might prove to be allies with women of the present. We were optimistic, circa 1970, that women would find their rightful place as subjects of study. All that was needed, according to the formula of the time, was add a woman and stir. First, the great women, the queens, and the novelists would take their rightful places beside the kings and the generals. Next, under the impetus of the then regnant social history, more ordinary women who had no heroic deeds to their credit, but whose activities could be dimly glimpsed in documentary records, would be added to the mix to provide a more adequate class representation. With historian Joan Kelly, we imagined that women's history would prompt new approaches to periodization, to categories of social analysis, and to theories of social change. With Kelly, we hoped to restore women to history and to restore our history to women. We felt confident that curricula in the humanities would be transformed by such efforts. Those of us in early Christian studies dug energetically into the extant Christian literature for evidence regarding women. Quite rapidly, texts pertaining to women martyrs and saints, aristocratic women in the circles of male authors, female heretics, heroines of popular early Christian fiction, that is such as the Apocryphal Acts, were revived, and collections of such texts in translation were edited for classroom use. It was in the early 1970s that I first developed a course rather ambitiously titled Women and Religion. It's hard to imagine having that today, but that's what we called it, which was among the first of its kind in America. This grand vision of transforming early Christian studies was elaborated at a time when American higher education was booming, when money for new appointments was relatively abundant, and when many departments within the humanities and social sciences were still growing. But this transformation did not happen as miraculously as we expected, and it was not just a question of recalcitrant male colleagues or tight budgets. Different problems attended the realization of that feminist dream. For one, historians of early Christianity, like other ancient historians, had to admit that the few women we did find in ancient texts were largely the notables, women of distinguished background and often staggering wealth, who renounced all and embraced Christian asceticism. Their stories were at least as much or even more about class than about sex. In antiquity in general, class was a more decisive marker than gender. We might discuss whether this is or is not the case today, still. We know about these women largely because their stupendous renunciations in the name of Christian devotion impressed male writers who preserved their stories for posterity. Their tales made excellent propaganda for the Christian cause in general and for Christian asceticism in particular. These women, despite their renunciations, often retained their access to real money and kept their status capital while acquiring an extra benefit, the symbolic capital that Christian leaders bestowed on ascetic virtuosi. In the lives and other writings about these women, they acquired an afterlife of even longer lasting memory than if they had conformed to the ideals of Roman matronhood. They are a strange example of the biblical injunction that to those who have, more will be given. In the fictional literature of the Apocryphal Acts, as well as in accounts of real women, modern readers are startled to find ascetic heroines who, although coming from the highest levels of society and hence expected to carry on familial inheritance lines, refused to marry, or if married, refused to have sexual relations with their husbands, and refused to serve as the conduit for family property and reputation to pass down through the centuries. This seemed like an offense against society itself. Their renunciations involved not just a choice of personal lifestyle, as we might phrase it. Refusing to contribute the children who would ensure a family's immortality of sorts, in effect condemned that family to oblivion and eventual death. As historians have noted, and the figures have been recently updated, each young woman in the Roman Empire who reached marriageable age would have had to produce 6 children to keep the population simply in steady state. So strongly did death wipe away children. Given the ancient overdetermination of femaleness as unstable and susceptible to demonic invasion, an overdetermination in which philosophy, law, drama, medicine, and poetry conspired, it is not surprising that women ascetics were deemed by their critics prone to irrationality of a most dangerous sort. So, the few women to be found in the sources, we did add in and mix. Many problems, however, beset the mix and stir model. At the simplest level, we learned that merely adding the great women to the mix, did little to aid the recovery of early Christian women in general. We remained ignorant regarding the larger population of Christian women from studying such texts as the life of Melania the Younger, a 4th and early 5th century ascetic heroine, whose annual income derived from inheritances, vast property ownership across the provinces of the Roman Empire, and the labor of thousands of slaves. Her annual income would have supported about 29,000 families. Yet, distressingly, women of the upper classes were usually the only members of their sex represented in the literature left to us from Christian antiquity. And researching elites was often deemed a dubious enterprise by historians committed to the study of women of color and working class women. Yet where were scholars of early Christianity to find women of other than the high social classes in their literature? Perhaps archaeology might lend some assistance in uncovering the everyday lives of ancient women, but such studies could not necessarily differentiate Christian women from their non-Christian counterparts on the basis of archaeological remains. A second problem. It was obvious that the early Christian literature about women was written by men and was so propagandistic and rhetorical that historians might despair of extracting anything useful about real women. So we looked to the so-called lower literary genres, such as letters, sermons, lives of saints, and pilgrimage accounts, to see if we could find more. In addition, the prescriptive documents referencing women, such as the canons of church councils and in church orders, that is, documents which told women what they ought to do, if read against the grain, would perhaps hint at women's actual activities. But we were still eagerly looking for women's voices. While the older add a woman stir formula doubtless enhanced historical and religious studies by raising female agency to the fore, other aspects of this pre-poststructural approach, as I like to call it, pre-poststructural, came under criticism. And I turn now to gender studies. The simplest form of gender studies grew in the late 1970s and early 1980s. 1980s. I've been working in the 19th century too long here. They are 1970s and early 1980s. From the rather obvious realization that women could not be studied in isolation from men. The interest in gender was stimulated first by the claim, widely accepted among Anglo-American scholars, that difference between the sexes is more socially and culturally than biologically constructed. Gender theorists assumed that sex was the raw material on which culture and history worked to produce gender, the socially constructed nature of sexuality and sexual relation. In a famous version of this model, Gail Rubin, through a reading of anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss and other French theorists, coined the phrase the sex-gender system, which she defined as the system of social relations that transformed biological sexuality into products of human activity, and whose end was the domestication of women. The turn to gender gave some malleability to the allegedly more intractable biological category of sex as we imagined it then. Scholars of early Christianity found much in their ancient texts that illustrated how malleable the concept of gender might be. Even in the ancient world, gender bending was rampant. Here again, asceticism provided provocative examples. If women were deemed the weaker sex, for example, by the author of 1 Peter in the New Testament, women ascetics showed that they, through ascetic renunciation, could overcome those societally assigned manifestations of weakness. Light-mindedness, vanity, frivolity, and lack of intelligence all rather miraculously were thought to disappear when a Christian woman adopted the ascetic life. So far did ascetic women escape the prejudicial categories ascribed to their sex that they were even called men or angels in 4th century literature. To these women and them only, Christian writers applied the famous lines of Galatians 3:28 that in Christ Jesus there is no male and female. Just as earlier, in the times of Roman persecution of Christians, young female martyrs were described as rising above nature, so now, post-persecution, women who dedicated themselves to sexual and other forms of renunciation for the sake of devotion to Christ were likewise deemed above nature, above human nature in general, and certainly above the alleged flighty and timid character of women in general. Enter theory. New intellectual and theoretical agendas soon disturbed the older quest for women. In the 1970s, scholars in the humanities, enamored of anthropology, think Mary Douglas, Clifford Geertz, often imagined ourselves as anthropologists, meeting face-to-face with native informants made accessible in texts. We often overlooked the fact that we dealt largely with literary texts, with representations, usually quite ideologically construed. Various forms of poststructuralist analysis soon taught scholars in many disciplines to be more sophisticated in their approach to texts. Historical work might be understood as an exercise in analyzing the process of representation and the function of ideas in ideological systems. Among the other gifts of theory was the critique of the quest for origins. In explorations of women in religion, this critique has been particularly prominent in studies of women in religions that have historical founders, most notably Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. In the 1970s, scholars of women in religious history often look back to a golden age of origins, often the origins of their own religion, to locate a time when women were supposedly accorded generous treatment by a prescient and charismatic founding figure. If the religion's founder ostensibly accorded women higher status than was the norm in his culture, could not present-day women look to that founding moment as a corrective to the later decline? In ancient Christianity, the incipient moment of debasement was placed as early as the Apostle Paul or as late as the institutionalization of the church in the 4th century. Whatever historical moment was chosen, the downhill trajectory was thought to gain speed after the time of Jesus. Accounts of pure origins and subsequent devolutions, whatever their historical credibility, served mainly to inspire present-day devotees. The search for the pristine origins of a religion often entailed a blaming of the other for misogynistic features and subsequent devolutions. Thus, a feminist Jesus was originally established at the expense of an impure forerunner, Judaism, while Islam was blamed for introducing the subjection of women into an allegedly pure religion of India. The quest for origins fell out of favor, with many working on more theoretical approaches to women and religion. Gender studies, too, rapidly saw the development of models inflected by post-structuralist theory. By the late 1980s, the clear distinction between sex and gender, so helpful in the earlier struggle to argue that biological sex was not determinative of women's aspirations, this was coming dismantled under the challenge posed by French theorists that centered on the primacy of language. For historians, the new discussion of gender was mediated by Joan Wallach Scott in a 1986 essay, Gender, a Useful Category of Historical Analysis. Scott, who had imbibed French post-structuralist theory, alarmed some social historians in her claim that gender must be related to symbolic systems, to its production in language, provided a way to attend to signification more broadly, to signify various relationships of power, or more broadly, to signify difference in general. Far from merely designating relations between the sexes, gender could serve as a code, for example, to convey notions of class or the relations between colonialist nations and their subjects. Scott's thesis was in line with the growing impact of French literary theory, with its insistence that concepts do not convey meaning on their own, but only in relationship to an other. Categories such as man and woman, thus, in Scott's words, hold no ultimate transcendent meaning, but still contain within themselves alternative, denied, and suppressed definitions. Thus, gender might be enlisted for analyzing power and linking power to the production of knowledge. Feminist historians might explore the representational processes by which understandings of men and women were constructed in all their particularity of time and place. Universalizing and naturalizing the categories of woman and man was now deemed a misguided ideological procedure. The turn to gender, especially as inflected by structuralist and post-structuralist theory, has been highly productive for scholars of early Christianity. Even if we could not often retrieve real women from the highly rhetorical, ideologically constructed, and male-authored texts with which we worked, we could find much of interest. I'd like to give a few examples of how this wider understanding of gender has helped us meaning people in early Christianity. The first takes its impetus from the now famous aphorism of Claude Lévi-Strauss that women were good to think with. Lévi-Strauss, when criticized for denigrating the female sex with this phrase, insisted he did not mean that women were mere tokens to be passed around in exchange like the pigs of the South American Indian cultures that he studied. Early Christian literature provides many examples of how women were good to think with. They, along with children, slaves, the lower classes, the mentally deficient, etc., prove useful as examples with which to combat or reverse the arguments of pagan critics, real or alleged, that Christianity gained its converts mostly from society's dregs. The Christian rebuttal could be directed in two ways. Either by claiming that wealthy, educated women, that is, not the dregs, were attracted to Christianity. This was not such a convincing strategy before the 4th century, when more upper-class women did convert. Or, more usefully, by conceding the disproportionate representation of the lowly in early Christianity, but construing this fact as a virtue rather than as a cause for reproach. Early Christian writers could argue that although the lowly were Christianity's main constituents, this demographic fact could be construed as a moral and religious virtue. The Apostle Paul's claim that God made foolish the wisdom of the world by choosing the foolish, the lowly, the despised, to shame the strong, could be developed in a socially specific way. Women might testify to the truth of Christianity by their virtuous lives. Despite their mental and other so-called natural deficiencies, they were transformed through God's empowering action. For example, the Latin church father Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, argued that wanton women have been reformed by Christian teaching. Surely the pagan detractors of Christianity do not wish to complain about moral improvement, he pointedly and rhetorically queried. Just as fishermen and tax collectors among Jesus' disciples could be touted as winning over many to the faith, so women, not only uneducated, but deemed weak, licentious, and easily deceived, could be represented as exemplifying Christian truth through their chaste lives. If even women, as the weak link, could be trained to virtue, how much more might men? If even women could be led to what was called a philosophical life, then Christianity should not be censured or persecuted. On this front, Christian writers could rebut pagan critics by offering stories of courageous women martyrs. Christian women's willingness to withstand excruciating tortures without recanting their faith served as a powerful shaming device for both Christian men and pagan torturers. As Bishop Dionysius of Alexandria claimed in describing the torture of Christian women, the Roman governor was put to shame by his inability to produce recantations. He was defeated by women. So early Christian women proved good to think with. I single out one book to illustrate the newer approach to gender in early Christian studies. Kate Cooper's book entitled The Virgin and the Bride, Idealized Womanhood in Late Antiquity, was published in 1996, but it is still very illuminating. Cooper's book details the disruptions that the rising tide of Christian fervor for sexual renunciation wrought on ancient Roman notions of chaste matronhood and the volatile role of gender in the discourse of moral superiority. Women, as Cooper explains, became arbiters in the competition for power between men. Cooper examines the ideology that measured a man's suitability for public duties and public office by the assumed quality of his marital relationship. It occurs to me some of the recent debates we have seen might have a point here, right? The concord between husband and wife, much praised in ancient Latin literature, served as an emblem of the self-mastery that made men reliable citizens, Cooper writes. Aristocratic chaste matrons thus assume a symbolic position as arbiters of masculine virtue, a symbolic function that the coming of Christian asceticism, with its message of sexual and marital renunciation, fiercely challenged. Indeed, Christian asceticism questioned whether there was a religiously positive role for married couples and a socially positive role for married women. Yet, despite asceticism's throwing what Cooper calls a wild card into Roman notions of social rank by its disruption of inherited patterns for negotiating status, it somewhat ironically drew from the same rhetorical font as did the ideal of a chaste wife as guarantor of social concord. Although virgin and chaste wife were dissociated from the stereotype of women as persuaders to vice, they left unchallenged the stereotype itself. Here we come to understand better the power dynamics of late ancient aristocratic manhood by seeing something about men in relationship to their women, women as real and as symbolic of wider social values. Some points for pondering. In this discussion of women and gender in early Christianity, one point stands out. The women who were written about by early Christian men were unusual, the martyrs and ascetics who disregarded familial and public opinion. These unusual women could be deemed scandalous, even crazy, by unsympathetic onlookers of the time. Yet what, if anything, in these representations might help us in our thinking today about women and education? In our era, in which parents and society at large urge young people to choose practical fields, to find their place in corporate society, education can easily become a mere mechanism for achieving career goals that involve status, money, and security. The older idea that the liberal arts were supposed to shape a young adult into a well-rounded person, equipped to be a good citizen and prepared to enter more specialized training for a profession, if such was desired, seems to have largely gone by the board. Now, non-specialized well-roundedness has given way to specialization and professionalization at an early stage. Returning to the 19th century professors I studied in my book, I acknowledge that their advocacy of a broad liberal arts education often sounded elitist. Specialization to some early 19th century ears, such as that of historian George Bancroft, sounded commercial. This is a very denigrating term, right? These people, commercial. Young men were being trained to sell their Greek and Latin. Elitist notions that higher education ought to be economically useless, its purpose being to form the mind and character of select youths, worked against the development of specialization. Professionalization came rather late to liberal arts education in America. The first PhDs in America in any subject were at Yale in 1861. In the study of history, for example, only from the 1880s onward did professionalization enable scholars in America to distinguish themselves from lay amateur writers, including women, and become, as historian Gabrielle Linkelbach puts it, self-referential, meaning they only dealt with people in their own fields. Now a man, I use the term advisedly, might strive for prestige and recognition within his own disciplinary community through research and publication. Research was increasingly imagined as producing knowledge, as posing and attempting to answer questions, not merely passing down commentary on older texts. Returning to today's scene, parental pressures are understandable given the very high cost of education. Parents want to be sure there will be some payoff for their sacrifices, and indeed, sacrifices are made, even if offspring do not attend colleges whose yearly price tag is upward of $50,000. For students today, even getting accepted is much tougher than it used to be. Whereas, as Louis Menand reported in an issue of the New Yorker last June, whereas in 1932, Yale accepted 72% of its applicants, almost a third of whom were sons of Yale's graduates. In 2010, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, et cetera, accepted 8% or fewer of their applicants. As Menand argued, and I agree, college should be more than what he called an efficient sorting mechanism for distinguishing more intelligent from less intelligent members of society. I see so many young people, both men and women, who feel they must major in something practical, even though quite a few use the mechanism of a double major or a second major or a minor to take what really interests them. This push towards considering college as a mere way station on the road to a lucrative career has, in my view, poisoned the atmosphere of even liberal arts colleges. In this move to early professionalization, the humanities have been hit hard. Menand reports that the #1 major in American colleges is business, a field that accounts for 22% of all bachelor's degrees. More than twice as many degrees are given every year, he adds, in parks, recreation, leisure, and fitness studies than in philosophy and religion. I was surprised to find that leisure was something you could major in, but I guess I can. I would like to do that. The decline in humanities majors is palpable, even at the allegedly more prestigious colleges and universities. Even the discipline of history, on the border between humanities and social sciences, is in jeopardy. Its status as a liberal arts major that provided education for informed citizenship and preparation for all kinds of future careers, including law school, has been displaced by what some might call jerry-built fields, such as public policy. How does this relate to gender? Here I find myself confronting a dilemma. The humanities used to attract a preponderance of female students, whether because female students had better reading skills from primary school onward than did their male peers, and hence gravitated to fields like English, or whether, in times past, women students were expected to marry soon after college graduation and did not need an education that prepared them for anything in particular, hence humanities, or for some other reason. There's been a great push in American education in recent decades to encourage young women to pursue math, science, engineering, and they have done so. Although according to a recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, not nearly in the numbers that some might wish. I'd like to celebrate women's entry to these STEM fields, yet women's entry to them, I suspect, accounts for some of the decline in the popularity of the humanities, hence my dilemma. Can the representations of early Christian women inspire us? Can we see anything in these women other than delusion? I would not recommend martyrdom as a satisfying career path for today's students, nor the kinds of extreme asceticism that these women embraced. Yet I think that the accounts of early Christian women's spirit, their willingness to defy societal pressures in the quest of some larger vision, are characteristics from which the young and even oldsters can take heart. Thank you.